Thank you very much. The Jewish people has been trying to understand the relationship between faith and nation for 3,000 years, and I can't solve the problem in 1 hour. So instead of trying to do that, I will try to do 5 things. I will make a brief introduction about the context where this dialogue is happening. I will say something about faith and nation in early Judaism. Thirdly, I will focus in on the complicated and central notion of the Jews as an Am Sgula, often translated as a chosen people. Fourthly, I will try to talk about the need to adapt and rethink these ancient categories in a modern context. And lastly, I'll say something specific about our contemporary Israeli context. So that's what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes. Number 1, I'm grateful to the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to come to this place and address the question of faith and nation in Israel. Every part of that sentence would take us a long time to understand. What Jewish religious tradition means by faith is different in many ways than how Christian theology has understood the notion of faith. What we mean by nation is complicated and different. We have different words in the Hebrew language which speak about different aspects of national identity. And of course, what we mean by Israel, the land of Israel, the people Israel, the state of Israel, each word in the title, it would take us a long time to unpack and to understand. My mother was born in Łódź, not so far from here, and my father in Sosnowiec, really quite close to this place. And I really, although I have many words usually to describe just about everything, I have no words to describe what it means for a Jew like me, born in the 20th century and trying to make sense of the 21st century, what it means to come to Oświęcimiu. So because I don't have my words, I will try to focus on the topic of our talk, and before that, to quote to you a poem written by an American Jewish poet, a woman called Muriel Rukeyser. This is from a longer poem that she wrote in 1944. I apologize to the translators who have to try to translate this poem, but what can you do? To be a Jew in the 20th century is to be offered a gift. If you refuse, wishing to be invisible, you choose death of the spirit, the stone insanity. Accepting, take full life, full agonies, your evening deep in labyrinthine blood of those who resist, fail and resist, and God reduced to a hostage among hostages. The gift is torment, not alone the still torture, isolation or torture of the flesh, that may come also, but the accepting wish, the whole and fertile spirit as guarantee for every human freedom, suffering to be free, daring to live for the impossible. Now, like most serious poetry, I can't tell you what Rukeyser means exactly in this poem, both because I'm not sensitive enough, and also because if we could explain what poems mean, we wouldn't need the poems in the first place. But I can tell you that many of these phrases from this poem resonate very strongly, for me at least, in this place and at this time, a time for Israelis and for Palestinians of extreme challenge and disaster. Here are some of the phrases that resonate for me particularly. Insanity. Those who resist fail and resist. God, a hostage among hostages. Hostages are very much on the minds of Israelis at the moment. An accepting wish, a hope for every human freedom, suffering to be free, daring to live for the impossible. One more word about this context of being here in Oświęcimiu. The late Rabbi Hugo Gryn tells a story from the time when he was here with his father, here in Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was sent here in 1944. His father decided that on the festival of Hanukkah, our winter festival, they would burn some of their margarine ration in a kind of menorah, a kind of lamp, a ritual lamp. They made a wick from the threads. He remembers, Hugo, that they had an old hat that they used to make the wick for the candle. The attempt failed, as other Jews, along with Norwegians and Poles, gathered round in Block 4, where they lived, to witness the event. Hugo was furious at his father for wasting the margarine, which could keep them alive. Hugo writes, "Patiently, he, my father, taught me one of the most lasting lessons of my life, and I believe that he made my survival possible. Don't be so angry," he said to me. "You know that this festival celebrates the victory of the Spirit over tyranny and might. You and I have had to go once for over a week without proper food, and another time almost 3 days without water. But you cannot live for 3 minutes without hope." So I come to this place as a Jew now in the 21st century, aware of the gift and in light of all of the torment and the suffering around us, gripped by concerns, yet fueled by hope. That was number one. Let's move to number two, faith and nation in early Judaism. Nation is a very complicated category in any language, and Jewish nationhood is extremely complicated. Most of the things we think we know about what it means to be part of the Jewish people, the more you learn about the reality of Jewish identity, the more you realize none of the categories really fit. There's no way really of disentangling faith from nation, the religious from the national, creed from identity in the history of Judaism before modernity. Since modernity, some attempts have been made to separate Jewish national identity from religious affiliation. In the foundational expressions in our tradition of this connection, there is no way also of separating the land from this equation. Here we have from the book of Genesis, the 12th chapter. God said to Avram, that was his name before it became Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make unto you a great nation." The word in Hebrew used there is goy. "And I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. V'nivrechu becha kol mishpachot ha'adama, all the families of the earth," you might literally translate, "will be blessed through you." In this foundational statement from the book of Genesis, this is about geography, it is about identity, it is about a response to a divine call, and it involves a global, universal horizon. In the book of Deuteronomy, you'll find a lot of nationhood ideology. If there's one book of the Hebrew Bible you want to explore to get some of those themes, I recommend Deuteronomy. In that book, special attention is paid to the status of the people Israel. For example, in the 4th chapter of Deuteronomy, "I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.'" What is Moses saying to his people? If you behave in the way I am telling you to behave, you will be considered a great and wise nation amongst the nations of the world. Or in the 7th chapter of Deuteronomy, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Ki am kadosh ata Adonai." Am kadosh, a holy people. "The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be God's people, God's treasured possession." Am segula, an almost untranslatable word that I'll say something about in a little while. It's translated here as treasured possession. That's one way of translating the expression. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous or because you were greater than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors that God brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, etc. And the chapter continues, "Therefore, take care to follow the commands, decrees, and laws I give you today." Listen to two voices in these words of Deuteronomy. There is a statement, you have been chosen by God, and next to the statement, there is a condition. You can attain this status if you behave in a certain way. One more example from the book of Deuteronomy, from chapter 26. "You have declared this day that the Lord is your God, and that you will walk in obedience to God, that you will keep God's decrees, commands, and laws, that you will listen to God. And the Lord has declared this day that you are God's people, God's segula, treasured possession, as God promised, and that you are to keep all of God's commands." This is a covenant moment, and both sides in the deal make a commitment one to the other. It is important to note that in these verses and in many other places in the Hebrew Bible, when the status of the people Israel is discussed, there are two key messages. One, that the people has some special connection with God, and two, that the people is called upon to behave in a certain way. The story of Jewish self-understanding on this question of faith and nation is very much the story of which of these two messages is given priority. In our tradition throughout the centuries, some have emphasized what you might call the ontological status. This is who you are, you're chosen by God. And others have emphasized the conditional status. If you behave in a certain way, then you will have the right to be considered God's special people. Powerful expression of the bond between the national and the creedal aspects of Jewish self-understanding can be found in a later book, in the words of Ruth to Naomi in the book of Ruth, when she refuses to leave her mother-in-law's side. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Many commentators in our tradition have noted the order of this statement. Your people will be my people comes before your God will be my God. It's not an abstract theological commitment followed by a national ethnic identification. It's the other way around. In ancient Judaism, then, a dialectic is played out in which two conceptions of Israel's purpose are in play. One is mission-driven, and the other suggests a fundamental, essential difference of status between the Hebrews and the other nations. You have an extreme version of that position in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In the return following the destruction of the first temple, where, for example, you will find the concept of Zera Kodesh, the holy seed. Many commentators, there's an important thinker in Israel today called Menachem Fish, who says that many of our problems in contemporary Israel are to do with the fact that we are living out the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and not the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. That version of Jewish identity, which emphasizes an exclusionary focus on our special status, that has become a dangerous commodity in contemporary Israel. Let me give you a statement, a teaching from the rabbis. We're moving now away from the period of the Bible. We're moving through Jewish history. Here is a midrashic statement attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai. So we are in the 2nd century of the Common Era. He uses a parable. He tells of a man who took ships and he bound them together. By the way, the historians tell us that this is probably based on a story that was told about the Emperor Caligula. Caligula, who was crazy, decided that he wanted to experience what it would be like to not to walk on the water, but to ride on the water. He took boats and he in the Bay of Naples, and he tied them together, and he rode his horse across the boats so that he could feel that he was riding on the sea. And in this midrash, Shimon Bar Yochai says it's like if a man were to take boats and tie them together and put them in the middle of the boats in the middle of the sea and build a palace on the boats. Now, if you're building a palace, normally you want to be on dry land with firm foundations. But the description, he then explains what the parable is about. This is what it means to be part of the people of Israel. To be close, to find the other boats in the flotilla, in the fleet, and to get close enough together so that even on the uneven surface of the sea, something great can be built on the foundation that we create together. This is not Ezra and Nehemiah talking about a holy seed. This is the notion that to be part of the Jewish people is to be committed to a great project. We are building a palace for God. That's the way the parable is understood. And the way we do so is, if you like, to give up on some of our personal autonomy and to tie ourselves next to other members of our people so that this palace can be built. And the Midrash goes on, if the boats stay together, the palace will stand. If the boats come apart, it goes down to the bottom of the sea. Israel's purpose is to come together and to realize its national mission, providing the basis for a great project, the building of God's palace. No individual boat has any more merit than any other boat. What matters is the way we come together. We become a people. As we come to the end of this very, very brief examination of some key themes in the development of the faith-nation connection in Hebrew identity and Jewish identity, I want to note two more important things. One, that the Jewish conception of faith is different to that which has developed in Christianity since Paul, and has typically been connected much more in Jewish tradition to the performance of deeds in the world, be they ritual, social, ethical, or all of the above. The great Jewish theologian Emil Fackenheim made a distinction between faith and fidelity, and said that often the contemporary Jew is called upon to express fidelity through acts in the world, and not necessarily abstract faith. I'm thinking of the great German Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, who pointed out that there is no commandment in our tradition, thou shalt believe. We have a lot of commandments, believe me, but that is not one of them. The second issue to be considered is that of power. Without sovereignty or agency, the rhetoric of Jewish particularism had a very different resonance than it does in modern times under conditions of Jewish statehood. What, again, Fackenheim has called the Jewish return into history. For Jews to believe in Baghdad 1,000 years ago, or in Spain 1,200 years ago, or in Yemen or in France, when they were often experiencing serious challenge and disadvantage, to believe that there was a purpose in their lives which was a great spiritual purpose, to fulfill the promise that was given to Abraham at the beginning of the story, that is different, and it plays out differently than when you have become a nuclear superpower and you are acting on the national stage. The challenge we face within Judaism today is, how do we build on these traditional tropes, traditional themes of faith and nation, and work out how to adapt them to our new reality? Number 3, the chosen people concept. The claim that God chose the Jewish people and gave them a special standing is a scandal. A skandalon in the original Greek means a snare, a trap, a stumbling block. Ever since the thorough dismantling of the concept of Jewish election by Baruch Benedict Spinoza in the 17th century, modern Jews have struggled to make sense of the idea that of all the peoples of the world, God picked out the Jews, bestowing them with particular qualities or certain responsibilities which set them apart from the rest of humanity. Now, Spinoza, in his Tractatus, takes on this idea of the Jews being chosen, and he tries to demolish it. He demolishes it for historical reasons, but also for theological reasons. Spinoza's God does not have favorites. Spinoza's God, which is another word for nature, the way the world is, can't express a preference for one thing over another or for one people. It's a theological impossibility. Jews, of course, are not more or less intelligent or more or less talented than anyone else. And so for Spinoza, divine favor could only mean that at a particular time in the Jews' history, things were going well for them. Then you could say that God had chosen them for a certain time. And when things were no longer going well for the Jews, it would appear God had stopped choosing them. In a very interesting passage, which has been important for Zionist thinkers ever since, Spinoza in the Tractatus says, in the 17th century, maybe one day they will have a state again. And then you could say that God has chosen them again. Modern Jews committed to Jewish continuity have had to come up with responses to the scandal of chosenness. Some accepted much of Spinoza's critique. I'll mention a couple of names to you. Mordechai Kaplan, a very important American Jewish thinker who died in the 1980s, asserted plainly the idea of Israel as the chosen people must be understood as belonging to a thought world we no longer inhabit. He said the idea is passé, it's impossible. From a feminist perspective, Judith Plaskow, an important 20th and 21st century theologian, condemns the idea of Jewish election, noting her objections to the doctrine center not just on its entanglement with external hierarchical differences, but with internal hierarchies as well. She attacks the idea from a feminist perspective, saying that it embodies power differentials and hierarchies that we cannot, in good conscience, accept. Other Jews, I want to tell you, have not been so prepared to give up on the idea of the Jews as an am skula, as having some particular role and distinct identity in the world. The chosenness of Israel, I'm quoting to you from Will Herberg, another American Jewish thinker, whether believed in or not, is an inescapable fact for the Jew. He uses the language of him, he cannot think or live as a Jew without in some way implying it. For better or for worse, it confronts him as a destiny which he cannot escape, because he cannot escape himself and his history. Herberg is saying, you may be uncomfortable with the idea of the Jews as a chosen, a special, an am skula people, but you can't ignore it. if you are sensitive to the full sweep of the Jewish experience. In medieval Judaism, we see different voices which connect to different aspects of chosenness. I will just mention two of the most significant medieval Jewish thinkers. For Maimonides, he does not emphasize the chosen status of the Jews. If you look to his 13 principles of faith, which is perhaps the closest that the Jewish religion has to a set of dogmas or doctrines, you will not find the chosen people in that list. His understanding is that the Jews are held contractually to behave in a certain way in the world. That's what chosenness means. If you look at one of the other great figures of medieval Jewish thought, Yehuda Halevi, you will see a very different voice. He's a 12th century Spanish poet and philosopher. He develops in his book, The Kuzari, an idea which is almost genetic. He suggests that over the centuries, a certain kind of moral trait has become embodied. So these two approaches, the contractual or the ontological, is being chosen a challenge to behave in a certain way, or is it a description of who you fundamentally are? These are playing out in the course of our tradition. A couple more modern thinkers I want to mention to you. Here's a very important one, Hermann Cohen, who died in 1918. One of the most articulate exponents of a theology of chosenness. He very much disagreed with Spinoza. He thought that Spinoza fundamentally misunderstood what it means to be a Jew. He also accused Spinoza of being disloyal to his Jewish heritage, if you like. How does a man like Hermann Cohen, one of the great figures of the liberal Jewish tradition in Germany, how does he understand the chosenness concept? A concept of mission, that the Jews are called upon to bring certain ideals and ideas. As we saw back in the book of Genesis, that is the fundamental idea that he emphasizes. He writes, "For the establishment of religion, the people of Israel was necessary. That is what it means for Israel to be the chosen people. Israel's role is necessary in the unfolding of a kind of moral development in the world." That is Cohen's way of putting this idea together. Opponents of this mission idea say that it misrepresents the pre-modern Jewish experience, and it also encourages a sense of inflated self-importance. Many Zionist thinkers rejected the idea of chosenness and instead valued the notion of Jewish normality. That we have wandered the world for thousands of years, thinking of ourselves as having a special status, and the time has come to stop that period of our history and just acknowledge our identity as a people like the Belgians and any people you now want to mention, the Croatians, all the best people. That should be the horizon of our ambitions. Now, that means that we will live out our Jewish national identity not exactly the same way as the French or the Germans or the Poles. We'll do so based on our tradition and our language and our land, but we should abandon some self-important idea of bringing a great mission to the world. So in the modern Jewish experience, and already in medieval times, Jews, this should not surprise you, are arguing with each other, that we argue with each other about everything all the time, but we're arguing with each other about how to interpret this concept of chosenness. Before I end this section, I want to mention something which takes us back to the Hebrew Bible. I don't want you to hear me saying to you that back in the time of the Bible, there was a primitive idea, and now in the modern period, we have sophisticated ideas. Anybody who reads the newspaper will realize that it's not clear that we're becoming more sophisticated or more humane or more anything as time goes by. It's fascinating to go back, for example, to the prophecy of Isaiah, of Yeshayahu, where he says in the 19th chapter of Isaiah, he looks forward to a day in which Israel will be part of a triad, a trilogy of nations. And how does he describe them? God is going to bless all of them, and God will say, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim." The word Am is used with relation to Egypt. Uma'aseh yadai Ashur, Assyria, my handiwork, Unachalati Yisrael, and Israel, my inheritance. Here you have from one of the great prophets of the Hebrew Bible a vision of God's blessing to a special people, but not one special people, three of them, in a kind of Middle Eastern, they didn't call it the Middle East in those days, but a sort of Middle Eastern coalition of two great empires and one small people in the middle, all of whom, according to the prophet, have a special kind of relationship with God. So the story that I'm trying to tell you is not a story of how an old primitive idea becomes modern and sophisticated. Rather, that different themes which were there from the beginning are being played out throughout our history. The word sgula, we now move to the fourth of my sections. The word sgula is difficult to translate, and it can, some have argued it comes from property law, and it's to do with a certain kind of a property or ownership, a special category, something particularly valuable. Some point out that in the ancient Near East, a word like it appears in treaties between nations, where a more powerful nation says to another weaker nation, "You will be my skula, you have special protected status." And maybe that's what God is saying to the Jews in that verse. But I want to do something that Jews always like to do, and to play a little bit with the word. The word segula has within it, all Hebrew words can be interpreted 100 different ways. That's what makes it so interesting and sometimes so frustrating. The word segula is also linked to the word in Hebrew that implies change and adaptation. In modern Hebrew, lehistagel is to adapt. And I want to argue that what needs to happen in this new reality, in conditions of political sovereignty and also significant agency, Jews in North America and in many other countries have power and influence in the world in a way that we have hardly known in our history. This forces us, encourages us to reimagine what we think the faith and nation equation looks like for us in this current reality. Let's say something about sovereignty. The impact of sovereignty, that the Jews have power. We've only had two other periods of power, political sovereignty, in our long history, and Israelis are very conscious of the fact that in both cases those experiments lasted for about 70 years, And we're now 75 years into this one, and we hope that things go better. But they're still in play. It's still unsure. This sovereignty in the modern context has implications which are only beginning to be realized. Now, some Jews, I told you that we are very argumentative with each other. Some Jews believe that we should prefer our anomalous status of being chosen in some abstract way. We should prefer that over the banal trappings of power with armies and national anthems and flags and all the rest of it. That's not for Jews, they say. That's for everybody else. We don't do that. This argument is made, for example, by Daniel Boyarin, a very significant Jewish thinker and academic, who asserts that in order to preserve the positive, ethical, political value of Jewish genealogy as a mode of identity, in other words, Jewish nationhood, Jews must preserve their subaltern status. Subaltern is a word, I'm from England and I don't know what the word means. It means something like powerless, inferior status. Jews must stay without power in order to continue to be the chosen people. That is Boyarin's position. Now, for many of us within Israel, that's an interesting theoretical idea, but it doesn't reflect the reality of millions of Jews from 130 countries who have come together to try and create a sovereign state, and to do so with decency and democracy and all the rest. You will find voices you'll find an increasingly polarized debate. Should we withdraw from the game of nations, from the game of thrones? Or should we perhaps throw away any idea of having a special chosen status? Sadly, tragically, a version of Jewish election is being deployed today in Israel in the service of a destructive theopolitics. If you take Yehuda Halevi from the Middle Ages and some mystical, Kabbalistic ideas and Hasidic ideas about the distinction between the Jew and the Goy, the Jew and the non-Jew, if you add to that equation an army, an economy, a narrative of David and Goliath, where we are always David and Goliath is always someone over there, and you have a very intoxicating and potentially lethal cocktail. Some Jewish thinkers at the dawn of the State of Israel, they saw the danger. Mordechai Kaplan wrote in 1949, Judaism can certainly not afford to harbor any doctrine which is in conflict with the ethical basis of democracy. The moment Jews start going against the ethical basis of democracy, we are bankrupt. We're in trouble. Earlier, Martin Buber spoke against this possibility. I want to quote to you Martin Buber in 1936. This is what he said. Israel is only chosen when it is not certain that it is chosen. That's a good line. I'm going to say it again. Israel is only chosen when it is not certain that it is chosen. When you are certain that you're chosen, this is me speaking now, not Buber, then you are no longer chosen. He wrote, if it is certain that it has been chosen, it is famous for itself. Does it benefit itself from the fact that it has been chosen? It now thinks that it has some security, and security that it has been chosen, then it is not chosen. Buber sets out the notion that you can only hang on to this identity of being Am Segula if you are not certain about it, if you live in a state of theological uncertainty. It's whenever a people becomes sure of its status in the world, that troubles begin. The last piece of this, and hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes for discussion. As you can see, I have not given you a close political analysis of everything happening in contemporary Israel, but I hope that when we have a discussion, we can tease out some of the themes I've been pointing to and see how they're actually at play in Israel today. The founding generation of the state of Israel was not guided by Ezra's vision of Israel's holy seed dominating all the other peoples or bringing about the restoration of the temple. Most of the leading architects of the state of Israel were secularists, driven by the hope that the Jews could become normalized, attaining national status like the French or the Belgians, expressing themselves through language, culture, territory, politics, and the like. But a combination of factors, internal and external, have led to the rise of a militant, extremist, and racist faction which has attained high office in Israeli society and which threatens the democratic nature of the state. So some of the current members of Israel's government coalition espouse views which I consider to be extremely dangerous and poisonous. And, you know, that's a problem, for example, when the minister in charge of the police holds those views. And he does. Some critics of Israel and Zionism say that this possibility was always inherent in the project of statehood, right? That it was only a matter of time until Israel would turn into something other than a liberal democratic society. Others disagree and say that it will be possible to overcome this wave of populism and to return to a more pragmatic, progressive, and pluralistic vision of Israel. My own Jewish commitments, my own theology of Israel is one which doesn't lose sight of the hope that I talked about at the beginning, that was experienced a kilometer away from here by Hugo Gryn, the acknowledgement that we cannot live very long if we give up on the possibility of hope. We are now at perhaps the most dramatic and fateful moment in the history of Israel since 1948, certainly since 1973. I moved to Israel 40 years ago, and there has never been a situation as dramatic as the one that is happening, unfolding at the moment. Some deeply consequential issues, most fundamentally, whether it is possible for Israel to be a Jewish and democratic state, are currently in play. In 2019, the government, a government I don't like, passed a nation-state law which speaks very much to the topic of our conference, where it tries to insist that you can only really be an Israeli if you acknowledge the special standing and status of Israel as a Jewish state, to the exclusion of any, you know, we have 20-25% of our population who are Israelis and not Jews. And the question is raised, what kind of vision, what kind of horizon, what kind of hope do we offer to them? What does the future hold? Some opponents of Israel insist that only a diaspora existence is appropriate for Jews. Some people who argue this are anti-Semites who just can't cope with the idea that Jews might have power. But others are not anti-Semites. They're diasporist Jews and others who are convinced that Zionism has been a wrong turn in Jewish history. Most Jews where I live, most Jews in Israel, reject that position. And they point out that in virtually any scenario, barring a second Holocaust, a second Shoah, there will continue to be millions of Jews in the Middle East alongside millions of Palestinians. And some modus vivendi, some political cultural, theological understanding will have to emerge. My view is that if we are to wield great power, we have to be am sgula, a people capable of adaptation. And we have to adapt some of the ancient themes of our identity to the reality of an era of power. It's a shame to finish with a grim thought, but I will mention in my last minute that Jews will soon be marking the festival of Purim, where we read the book of Esther and tell the story of Haman and Ahasuerus. I mention marking the festival because every year we celebrate it with it's our happiest festival. Everybody dresses up and you're meant to get drunk. It's a religious obligation to get drunk on that day. But this year in Israel, there are very few people who have the appetite to celebrate in the middle of this terrible situation that's happening. In 1994, Baruch Goldstein, a settler of American extraction, went into the cave of the patriarchs, massacring, killing 29 Muslim worshippers and wounding a further 125. He did so on the festival of Purim. He was guilty, in my view, apart from murder and all the rest of it, he was guilty of not being part of Am Segula, a people that can adapt. We read the story of Esther, including the 9th chapter, if you remember the story, where the family of Haman is destroyed. We read that for centuries when we had no power at all. It was an absurdist fantasy. But now we have power, and we have to find a way of living in that reality and not interpreting the book of Esther with a machine gun. If we want to hang on to our power, we will need to change our attitude to religious tradition. Israelis have to work out what kind of state we want to live in and what its relationship to Judaism should be. Can we imagine an Israeli identity 100, 200 years in the future perhaps, which is significantly separate from and distinct from the Jewish roots of our identity? Jews, ever since the beginning of the modern era, have faced a major challenge. Can we live, how can we live as Jews in dignity and security? Can we make our Judaism, our Jewish identity, a conduit for our humanity, living out the promise of Abraham's blessing, being a blessing amongst the nations? Can we make our Jewishness an expression of each of our individual yearnings? Can we be, to use a Hebrew expression, an Am Olam, which means an eternal people and a global, universal people? To be a Jew in the 21st century, to paraphrase the poem which I began with, is to be offered a gift. Am Sekula, the treasured people, should also be the people of adaptation. I hope we are given the gift of change, of response to changing historical realities. My hope in this place, a hope which burns even when the margarine does not set light, is that we will find, all of us, the inner strength necessary to adapt as we maintain the outer strength necessary to prevail at this challenging time.